Okay, so we're going to finish up monetary policy and talking about the Federal Reserve. But just a reminder, the Federal Reserve oversees commercial banks and they influence the interest rate, which therefore either stimulates the economy and growth or slows the economy down to control high inflation. So the first thing was a required reserve ratio, which we talked about last week. That's the amount of money banks have to keep on hand in reserves, excess reserves, that they have to keep in their vaults. So today we're going to talk about the discount rate and then open market operations. All right, so last week we had a little bit on the federal funds rate, which was if your bank, let's say you're the bank of Wells Fargo, and you have a loan opportunity, but you don't have enough excess reserves, so you want to borrow from the bank of Chase Manhattan Bank or whatever. That's a bank-to-bank rate. Well, you can also, if your bank really wants to make a large loan, because remember that's how you make money, and let's say you don't have enough excess reserves to make the loan, you can also as a bank borrow money from the Federal Reserve, and that's the discount rate. It's the interest rate the Federal Reserve charges to commercial banks or credit unions, and those loans are all fully secured. If the Federal Reserve charges a high interest rate to commercial banks, it's saying they don't want banks to make loans. It's called the tight money policy. They're trying to reduce the supply of money, and they're communicating don't make loans. If the Federal Reserve charges a very low interest rate to banks, it's telling banks go out and make loans. It's called easy money supply. We want to make loans. We want to increase the money supply. We want to have a lower interest rate. Because remember, supply and demand of money, if money is scarce, means there's not a lot of it, you're going to have a higher interest rate. If there's lots of money out there, you're going to have a lower interest rate. So the discount rate is rarely used because banks don't want the Federal Reserve in their business because, you know, they're the regulatory agency that oversees them. They don't want them checking up on them constantly and potentially. It's basically, the discount rate is basically used as a way for the Federal Reserve to communicate to banks on how they want them to behave. Rarely used because banks don't want to go through the Federal Reserve for that. They'd much prefer to borrow from a local bank down the street versus the Federal Reserve. Okay, so open market operations. This is the most used action by the Federal Reserve. It's the easiest. They can do it overnight. In fact, you can watch them. The Federal Reserve has a link where you can watch it live when they're making their decisions and policy changes. But the purchase and sale of securities in the open market by a central bank. Central bank refers to the Federal Reserve, and this is the key tool that they use to implement monetary policy. A security is an IOU. It can be called a bond, a treasury bill, but it's basically they buy or sell bonds, securities, T-bills as an IOU to the government. So it's considered a very secure investment by businesses and people alike, and so they either buy or sell government securities. If the Federal Reserve sells bonds in the marketplace, and normally I'd have whoever was playing the Federal Reserve with a big floppy red, white, and blue hat would be selling this, and you guys would have money. You would be banks, and you'd be businesses, and you'd be consumers. If they sell bonds, they're soaking up the money supply. They're taking money out of your checking account or whatever account, and it's shifting the supply of money to the left. So it's increasing the interest rate. If the interest rate goes up, aggregate demand is also going to go down. It's going to go to the left because consumers and businesses alike have less money to spend. You've just bought some treasury bills or government IOUs, and now you don't have that to buy a new house or a new car or whatever it is. And so when the Federal Reserve sells bonds, they're going to increase the nominal interest rate, which is going to slow the economy down. And they do this when we have high inflation. If the Federal Reserve purchases bonds, buys bonds in the marketplace, this pumps money into the market because you would be sitting at the table and you'd have all this money. I would have all this money if I'm the Federal Reserve or whoever's playing that. And I go and I purchase bonds from you, and I'm giving you thousands or millions of dollars to buy these government bonds. You now have more money in the marketplace. So it causes a supply of money to shift to the right. It will lower the interest rate, and with a lower interest rate, consumers spend more. We just put in a whole new house fan in our house, pretty exciting last week. And the guy said that he and his wife rushed to buy a house in Severance because he goes, the interest rate was so low. This was their first house. He goes, we felt this was a great time to buy a new house because of the low interest rate. And so consumers spend more, businesses spend more with a lower interest rate. So that stimulates aggregate demand. When aggregate demand is stimulated, GDP increases, our output increases. It shifts to the right. It shifts to the right. More people have jobs. So we have more growth. So, and that are there 3 ways that they affect the interest rate and the supply of money. Again, that's required reserve ratio, the discount rate, and open market operations.